Hi everyone, happy Wednesday. It is a Wednesday in July and it is beautiful. While my two boys are at camp, I thought I would pop on and just make a quick little video with you talking about encoding. So encoding, just so we're all on the same page here, is basically spelling. It's taking the sounds we hear or the words we hear and translating them into written language. And we can do this both while writing the words and also while building the words. So in today's video, I have 3 activities to share with you that you can incorporate into your literacy instruction to help your students with their encoding. If you're ready for this video, give me a thumbs up. Make sure you are subscribed to my channel. Let's get started. All right, if you watched last week's video right there, I made a long video just sharing 5 ways you can kind of level up your literacy instruction for next year. And one of those ways I mentioned was having students consistently practice their encoding and dictation. For a long time, decoding or teaching students how to blend sounds together to make words took up a bulk of the phonics instruction that we would teach our students. And then we kind of tacked on some spelling practice at the end. But we really know that for students to build strong relationships between the phonemes they hear and the graphemes that they see and write, we need them to be able to do both. So while decoding is still very necessary, we also need to make sure we're having students practice encoding as well. So that is where these 3 little activities are going to help out. All right, activity number 1, and probably the most popular, is dictation. Now, dictation in the classroom should happen at least 2 to 3 times per week, and that is at bare minimum. Many programs and researchers say that it should be part of every single phonics lesson, which is fine, but of course in an ideal world, that means our phonics lessons would be like 45 minutes. I would be able to squeeze everything in, but many of us are lucky if we have a 30-minute phonics block, which we absolutely should. That's like the bare minimum for that. But with 30 minutes, it can sometimes be hard to do a full dictation routine, right? Where we want students writing down the sounds they hear and then words that we are specifically giving them, reviewing old words that we've already done so we can spiral it in, and then also going to sentences. So we do want to make sure we're kind of following that full dictation routine at least 2 to 3 times per week, but then we can see other ways we can sprinkle in this different dictation. Now, when I'm talking about a full dictation routine, I often like to have students start with the sound and just write some letters individually first, or some letter groupings. So for example, I might say, everybody listen. Okay, spell f, and I'm looking for them to write F. Leave a space, spell write spell sh, sh. Any patterns that we've kind of already been taught. With dictation, it is always going to be sounds and words that I've already explicitly taught to my students. Even if it was just within that lesson, you can definitely mix in some older things as well as the new patterns that you just taught that day. So I do a few letters at first, or letter groupings, and if there's more than one way to make that letter, I will say, show me the different ways you know to spell k. And I'm looking for C, K, and CK. And then I'll go down to some words. Okay, let's spell the word wish. Now, to help scaffold this, I will often like to give some of those review sounds, especially if they're going to be in the words we're going to be dictating. So if it was a word like wish, I might have as some of those that I, I'll do the vowel sound, and I'll have the sh as sounds in isolation that students have already written previously. And when you're doing dictation, you can do this a few different ways. You can definitely have your students just have their whiteboards out, and you can quickly kind of just walk around. You can also have students do it on a piece of paper or in a notebook. I do like to do that option at least once a week. A notebook specifically really allows you to kind of see the growth students have made in spelling throughout the year, and then also really helps you kind of highlight and easily see which patterns students might be struggling with. So first we do the sounds, then we do the words, and then I always like to give a sentence as well. And again, the sentence should be sounds and words that your students already know how to write. So many programs like Foundations, for example, I believe UFLI as well, they already have some example sentences that you can give and some words that you can give that all already include patterns you've previously taught to make it nice and easy. I do have a teacher dictation list. I have both a word list and a sentence list that goes in a sequential order. They look like this. They're in my SJT Clubs, and I know the word list is free. I think the sentence list, I'll just give it to you guys for free too. So I'll go ahead and link that down in the description so you can check that out in case you don't have a program that already has some decodable sentences for you. It's also important to note that with dictation, immediate feedback is going to be necessary. This is really a nice quiet time. I have students sitting up nice and straight, and they're in their proper writing position. They're listening for each sound and they're writing it down. As you walk around, if you see a student make a mistake on a sound, you correct them right away. You might want to show them your mouth and what they might hear, show them how to form the letter, whatever is necessary. If you have students, I had an aide in my classroom this past year, so she had, the few students that she would pop in on and really kind of take a close look at each time we were doing a word or a sentence or a sound, and I would monitor the rest of the class. When she wasn't there though, I would have those students come to the rug so I can dictate the word and sentence. I can kind of quickly look down at all of them together at one time, and then I would quickly do a scan around the room to make sure there was anybody else. If I needed to correct them or give them some feedback, I could do that nice and easily. So even just pulling that group over in one central kind of easy to check in space is a nice way to make sure you're giving them that feedback. The whole dictation process really doesn't need to take more than like 7-8 minutes. That sentence is almost always the longest part. It takes a lot for those students to say the sentence, and this is how I do it too. I will say, everybody listen to the sentence. I will say it. They have to repeat it back after me, and then we need to count the words that are in the sentence. So if I'm saying the cat sat on the mat, I would say, all right, repeat. The cat sat on the mat. Let's count it. The cat sat on the mat. We're looking for 6 words. Now, if we're gonna talk a little bit about scaffolding throughout this routine, for my students that are doing this sentence, I almost always at the beginning of the year had everybody go ahead and draw 6 lines on their whiteboard, or they would draw 6 lines in their notebook. This was going to tell us that we had 6 words in this sentence for us to remember. The cat sat on the mat. Now you can also scaffold at the word level. In many different programs like Foundations, we do tapping out. Other programs, you might count the sounds. I will definitely at the beginning of the year teach my students to count those individual sounds, and that's how many sounds we are writing down onto our paper. Now that again is a scaffold. It's not something that's supposed to be there all year long. And as students don't need it anymore, they kind of naturally drop it, or sometimes I'll ask a student to challenge themselves if I think they're ready. I'll ask them to challenge themselves. Do you need to count that out, or can we just do it sound by sound? And then it's a good reminder for your students that maybe can't, or they're struggling. Say, hey, go back and count those sounds. How many sounds should I see on that paper? Things like that. And one kind of just fun little way we might switch it up is, here is a picture of my students last year. Every once in a while, if I didn't have time for a full dictation routine, I would throw up a slide like this with a bunch of images, and we would go over every image first so every student knew what they were spelling. And then I would just put a 3 or 4 minute timer on the board, and students had to see how many of these words they could spell before the timer was up. And it was just a little challenge within themselves, but they had to go ahead and look at each word, see what they could remember, and write it down on their whiteboard. I like this too because students could kind of challenge themselves. Some of my students were able to write all of the words in about 2 minutes, and I would challenge them to go back, double check that they're all spelled correctly, and then they would help me when the activity was over, which I'll tell you in a minute. And then my other students who were only able to write maybe 3 or 4 words, I would get to work with them pretty closely, help them tap out those sounds. What do we hear? What comes next? And then we could also pick the word we wanted to spell, right? So you could throw up some challenging ones up there for some of your students working above grade level. You could throw in some review words in there for students who want to feel confident, right? And they could say, oh, I know how to spell that one, and they can get started right away. Now, once the timer went off, I would say, all right, hands up. They put their caps on their markers, and I would actually give them a different color marker because this is when we're going to correct it. So this is when I might call a student up and I'd say, okay, what word is this? Can you show me how you wrote it on your board? I would have already checked that it is correct, and then everyone needs to check theirs against what the student wrote. And they would give themselves a little check on their whiteboard, or they would just fix what they needed to fix on their board before we moved on. But it was just a fun little switch up for dictation. All right, activity number 2 to help students with encoding is going to be word building. Now, usually when we're thinking of encoding or spelling, we're almost always thinking of them actually writing the word down, but magnets and magnet tiles can be a great way to help students with their encoding practice as well. Being able to physically maneuver the tiles and switch them up as needed is also a little less intimidating than having to erase every time and redo it if it's incorrect. Now, word building can work in the same way as dictation does, and often I like to start the same way by starting with those sounds. So I typically use the Foundations boards. They already come, there's a picture of them like this. If you're familiar with Foundations, that is what we have. Many other programs already do have letter tiles or magnets of some sort. People make them however you want to do it is totally fine. But essentially here there's a magnet with each letter or letter sound on there for students to build the words they hear. So they're still doing that same thing. They're that same translation from what they're hearing to actually building it into a word and spelling it correctly with the graphemes. Now again, to scaffold and kind of warm up our brains here, I do like to have students start with that sound. So I will say, point to the letter that makes ah. Point to the letter that makes eh. Point to the letter that makes eh. And these are some of the visuals I give my students as needed. Instead of just pointing to it, sometimes you can say hold it up, sometimes you can say build it, where they might actually move it down to like a line on their mat of some kind. It's up to you, but I do like to have them practice with some of those sounds first. Again, just like with dictation, if I'm going to have them build words with digraphs, especially if it's a newer skill or something that they're struggling with, I will definitely point those out during this individual time. So I'll say point to the letters that make sh. Point to the letters that make ch, etc. And for some reason, word building is just way more engaging than regular dictation practice. I think largely because writing for students is just such a difficult process between everything going on in their brain, the fine motor skills. Again, like I said earlier, if they mess up with the magnet, they can just remove it. But if they mess up on pencil, they have to erase the whole thing or correct it. It's just a more engaging process, and they're like little tiles that they get to play around with. Now, another reason I love using the tiles is because you can do word ladders or word chains really easily. I'm sure many of you know already what a word chain or a word ladder is, but just in case you don't, you would start with a word like this. You'd tell everybody to spell the word tap. T-a-p. You can make sure the word is spelled correctly and then tell students, okay, we're gonna change one letter here and we're gonna change tap to map. And I like to always tell them we're gonna change one letter. I might tell them if needed where that letter is going to be. I might say, okay, we're gonna change that first letter. Again, you can scaffold it as needed and give as much guidance as your students need. And then eventually you don't need to tell them anything. You can just say, okay, we have map. You're gonna change that to cap. How would we do that? And with word chaining, you always want to start with changing that initial phoneme for your kindergarten students and beginning of the year 1st grade. Then you can go to changing the final phoneme and then the medial phoneme too. So you can change up kind of anywhere. So you might say tap to map to cap to cop to cup. With those Foundations boards, since it had like a cover, I would say, okay, try to change the word cup to cop and cover it up. And then I would come around and I would say, okay, left up. And I would like check real quick and then I'd say, okay, let's see if you got it right. And we'd all like reveal our boards. Again, the magnets are just a lot more engaging. And activity number 3 is to make sure you are having students practice encoding along with decoding during their independent and partner practice. Again, when we have students kind of go off from us and they're practicing things on their own, usually those phonics centers and phonics activities we would have students do largely have them practicing decoding, but we want to make sure we have that encoding practice as well. I'm going to share a few of my favorite and easy activities that students can do either independently or with a partner. The first one are these phoneme grapheme mapping mats. Now, phoneme grapheme mapping is such an easy and great way for students to practice their encoding. And these are ones that I usually use in small group, but then I can move them off to a center. Here you see the picture of the chick up at the top, and these are all themed based on different skills. So this skill in particular was digraphs. So students would go ahead and flip a card. They would say the word aloud, chick. They would have to move a cube or some sort of manipulative into each box to show how many sounds there are, and then they would write it down below. Now they would also take, here in this picture it's a little ant, but each theme is different, and they would take that ant on the popsicle stick and kind of go under the word 3 times and read it chick, chick, chick. and then when they were done, they would flip a new card, like ship, and they would do that same thing over and over again. Another easy and well-known activity is a write the room spelling activity. Now, I love a good write the room activity. Here are some ones that I've used in my classroom, and all students need to do is you put up the cards around the room and they walk around and they spell them. These again are based on phonics patterns, so if we are working on digraphs, this one would be all 4 digraphs and all the words should be decodable. Now, to help differentiate this, I would definitely put up those cards around the room. My students would grab their clipboard and go off, but then I might pull a group back with me, and I will have the same cards, and maybe we are just working on a few of them, or at least I'm there to give them that immediate feedback as needed. But you can definitely have students kind of go off, and then you can pull some students back to you and they're doing the same activity, but you're there to kind of guide them through it. Another one is through phonics task cards. Now, just this past year, I came out with a ton of different phonics task cards for all sorts of different skills. This is the bundle right here. And what I did is when I made each of them, I really tried to make sure that within each task card group, within each skill, there was lots of practice for decoding and practice for encoding as well. So here's an example from the suffix S skills. So there's 4 or 5 different tasks in here, and this one is a spelling one. So students had to go ahead and look at the image. This one had frogs, and then they had to spell it on the line. And in this activity, since it was suffix S, they had to, some of the images were plural and some were not. So they might have cat and they would have to recognize, do I need to add an S on the end or no? Frogs they do, cat they don't, obviously. And just for some other examples, here are some task cards from my floss rule, that double letter at the end. Here is one for doll. I actually have a little scaffold in there where students have the beginning 2 letters and they have to apply that double L on the end, so they're writing that down. And then this is a more difficult one over here where students have a word like bed, and they even have it written out for them, bed, and then they have a picture of bell. So this is kind of like a word chain, but with those double letters there. So they have to take the word bed, see what they need to remove, and turn it into bell. Within each different skill, there's different types of decoding and encoding practice. There's also like phonemic awareness activities in there. I really wanted to make sure that the task cards covered a wide variety of skills. So when my students go off and practice them, I know they're hitting decoding, encoding, phonemic awareness, all those different things. Another one my students loved this past year were these decodable sentence scrambles. Again, here we have the decoding practice. We have that syntax practice. There are, I think there's 300 different sheets in this unit that I made, all with decodable sentences that students have to rearrange and paste in the correct order, but then they also have to write down that sentence underneath it. So this way they're practicing a bunch of different skills. Another activity I love is spin, say, and spell, and I like these because they go through all different phonics skills and you can really differentiate it as needed. So if you're giving this whole group, you can give out different sheets to different students based on what they need to practice. Also, I like this because they can play independently or they can play with a partner who checks them, but all students will have to do is spin the little spinner in the corner. It will have some images based around a phonic sound. They will have to spin it, say the image aloud, and then go ahead and spell it over on the lines. And they just keep going back and forth, or they continue it themselves until they fill in all 10 spaces. And last but not least, of course, you want to also practice that encoding during your small group time. Both my one-page interventions and my decodable mini books always have a spot for encoding just naturally, so it's in the space. It also helps remind me as the teacher to make sure that I am teaching the sounds, reviewing the sounds, reading them, and writing them within our lesson. Each of those activities I just shared are in the SJT Literacy Club. Most of them are also available on TPT, but they're all in the club in one easy spot. And the SJT Literacy Club is open through the rest of July for the upcoming year. So if you have any questions about that, let me know down in the comments. I will go ahead and put a link to it in the description so you can check it out. All right, so there were 3 easy things you can do to help your students with encoding this upcoming year. Just to quickly recap them, number 1 was to make sure you are doing a true dictation routine with your students at least a few times a week, and also make sure you're giving them that immediate feedback. Number 2 is to incorporate some word building activities with those fun magnet tiles or letter tiles. And number 3 is to make sure you're balancing decoding activities with encoding activities in your students' independent and partner practice. So when they're going off to practice on their own, make sure they have some opportunities to encode or spell the words they're learning. As always, I do hope you enjoyed this video and found it helpful. Always ask any questions, comments, concerns, leave them down in the comments. And if you did like this video, please give it a thumbs up so I know. Make sure you are subscribed to my channel and click that bell. That way you're notified of every new video. See you in the next one. Bye.